You do not build the future of your country's rockets out of an enemy's nightmare weapons. You do not take the men who built terror machines, men who used slave labor and death camps to manufacture them, and give them laboratories, salaries, and honors in your own capital. That is not how civilized nations behave. That is not how victorious democracies operate. You defeat evil. You punish it. You do not hire it. In 1945, as Allied forces swept through the ruins of Nazi Germany, that rule seemed obvious. When American soldiers first found the wreckage of German V-2 rockets, massive, strange machines that looked more like science fiction than military hardware, many dismissed them as expensive toys, desperate gambles by a regime that had already lost the war. British intelligence officers called them vengeance weapons, propaganda tools designed to terrorize civilians, not change the outcome of battles. American generals focused on tanks, bombers, and infantry. Rockets? Interesting maybe. Decisive? No. But as engineers began examining the V-2 fragments, as intelligence officers read through captured documents from a place called Peenemünde, as interrogators sat down with German scientists who had built these machines, the dismissals became quieter. The mockery stopped. Because the science was not a toy, it was not desperation, it was decades ahead of anything the Allies had imagined. And the men who created it were not fanatics screaming in bunkers. They were brilliant, methodical engineers who had solved problems the Allies didn't even know existed yet. In the spring of 1945, that rule, the one about not building your future from an enemy's nightmare, quietly began to crack. And by the summer of 1945, it was broken completely. But in the last year of the war, one man and one family of rockets that killed thousands changed that rule forever. His name was Wernher von Braun. And this is the story of how the terror weapons he built for Hitler became the foundation for the missiles and spacecraft we still launch today. Wernher Magnus Maximilian Freiherr von Braun was born in 1912 into Prussian aristocracy. By the time he was 18, he was already obsessed with rockets and space travel. By the time he was 20, he was working for the German Army's rocket development program. By the time he was 25, in 1937, he was technical director of a sprawling secret facility on the Baltic coast called Peenemünde. He was tall, handsome, charming, fluent in English, comfortable in a tuxedo or a lab coat. He loved fast cars and skiing. He dreamed of sending humans to the moon, to Mars, beyond. He read science fiction. He sketched spacecraft. He calculated trajectories to distant planets. But to fund those dreams, he built weapons for Adolf Hitler. Peenemünde was not a crude military base. It was a high-tech city, built from scratch in one of the most remote corners of Germany. Laboratories, wind tunnels, test stands for rockets that towered 5 stories high, airfields, modern housing for scientists and engineers. It looked like the future, clean, orderly, advanced. And it was secret, so secret that most Germans didn't know it existed, so secret that when British intelligence finally learned about it in 1943, they could barely believe the scale of what was being built there. By 1942, von Braun and his team had developed the A4 rocket, later renamed the VB-2 for Vergeltungswaffe 2, Vengeance Weapon 2. It stood 46 feet tall, it weighed 12 tons, it carried a 1-ton warhead, and it could fly over 200 miles, reaching altitudes of 55 miles, higher than any aircraft of the time, before plunging down at over 3,000 miles per hour, faster than the speed of sound. There was no defense against it, no way to shoot it down, no warning, just sudden, inexplicable destruction. But building the V-2 at scale required resources Germany no longer had. The Allies were bombing German factories day and night. Supply lines were collapsing. Fuel was scarce. Skilled workers were being drafted or killed. So the Nazis made a decision. They would move production underground into tunnels carved out of mountains where Allied bombers couldn't reach. And they would use slave labor, prisoners from concentration camps, to do the work. The largest of these facilities was Mittelbau Dora, near the town of Nordhausen in central Germany. Prisoners, Jews, Soviet POWs, political dissidents were forced to dig tunnels, assemble rockets, and whole components in conditions so brutal that survival was measured in weeks, not months. The tunnels were cold, damp, and filled with rock dust that tore apart prisoners' lungs. There was no sunlight. Rations were starvation level. Beatings and executions were routine. If you collapsed, you were left to die or shot on the spot. Over 60,000 prisoners passed through Mittelbau Dora and related sites. At least 20,000 died there. More people died building the V2 than were killed by the V2. Von Braun visited these tunnels. He saw the conditions. He knew. Years later, he would claim he had no choice, that he was just an engineer focused on the science, that the labor camps were not his responsibility. But the evidence shows he was there. He selected workers, he signed documents, he knew, and he kept building. Because for von Braun, the rocket was everything. The moon, Mars, the stars, those dreams justified the compromises. The weapons were just a means to an end. The deaths were unfortunate, yes, but necessary to reach the future he imagined. By late 1944, the stakes were clear. If the V2 worked at scale, if Germany could launch hundreds or thousands of them, the Allied bombing campaign might be slowed, civilian morale in Britain might crack, and the war, already certain to end in German defeat, might drag on for months or years longer, costing hundreds of thousands more lives. If the V2 failed to deliver, it would be remembered as an expensive, brutal waste, blood and treasure, poured into a weapon that killed thousands but changed nothing. And von Braun? He stood at a crossroads. The Reich was crumbling. The Soviets were advancing from the east, the Americans and British from the west. The rocket program was running out of time. What would he do when the war ended? Surrender? Fight? Disappear? The answer would shape the next 70 years. It is September 8th, 1944. You are standing on a street in Chiswick, a quiet suburb in West London. It is early evening. The war has been going well for the Allies. Paris was liberated 2 weeks ago. Everyone believes Germany is finished. Victory feels close. And then, without warning, the street in front of you explodes. No air raid siren. No sound of an approaching aircraft. Just a sudden, massive detonation. A crater 30 feet wide appears where a row of houses stood seconds ago. 3 people are dead instantly. Dozens more are injured. Debris rains down for blocks. And only after the explosion, seconds later, do you hear the sound. A roar, like thunder, as the shockwave from the rocket's supersonic flight finally reaches your ears. This is the V2, and it is unlike anything the world has seen. You cannot hear it coming because it travels faster than sound. You cannot shoot it down because it flies higher and faster than any fighter or anti-aircraft gun can reach. You cannot see it because it falls from the edge of space, plunging down at over 3,000 miles per hour. All you can do is hope it does not land on you. Over the next 7 months, Germany launches more than 3,000 V2 rockets, most of them aimed at London and Antwerp. They kill approximately 9,000 people, far fewer than conventional bombing, but the psychological impact is enormous. People feel helpless. There is no shelter deep enough, no warning system fast enough. You just live your life and pray that today is not the day a rocket falls on your street. One British civilian later writes, "It was like being struck by lightning. You could do nothing to prepare, nothing to protect yourself. You just waited and hoped and tried not to think about it." But the V2 is not the only weapon Germany deploys. There is also the V1, the buzz bomb, a small pilotless aircraft powered by a pulse jet engine. It flies low and slow compared to the V2, but it is cheap to produce. Germany launches over 10,000 of them. You learn to listen for the sound, the buzz. As long as you hear it, you are safe. But when the engine cuts out, when the fuel runs dry, and the bomb begins its dive, you have maybe 10 seconds. You run. You dive for cover. You hold your breath. And then the explosion. One survivor recalls. You would be sitting at the dinner table, and you would hear the buzz, and everyone would stop eating, stop talking, and listen. And when the engine stopped, you would freeze, and you would count 1, 2, 3, and then the world would shake. Over 6,000 British civilians die from V1 attacks. Thousands more are injured. Entire neighborhoods are destroyed. But as terrifying as these weapons are, they do not change the outcome of the war. Germany cannot produce them fast enough. The guidance systems are crude. Many missed their targets entirely. The payload is by too small to cripple British industry or morale. What the V1 and V2 prove is this: you can build an unmanned, guided weapon that can fly hundreds of miles and strike a target. You can build a rocket that can leave the atmosphere and return with devastating force. The technology works, the concept is sound, and that knowledge, that proof, will outlive the Third Reich. Meanwhile, at Peenemünde and in the tunnels beneath the Harz Mountains, von Braun and his team work around the clock. Allied bombers have already struck Peenemünde in August 1943, killing hundreds of workers and scientists. Production has moved underground. Resources are scarce. But the rockets keep launching. You descend into the tunnels at Mittelbau Dora. The air is thick with dust and the smell of unwashed bodies. Prisoners in striped uniforms shuffle past, eyes hollow, moving components from one station to another. Guards watch from the shadows. The sound of hammering, welding, and machinery echoes off the stone walls. You see a V2 rocket being assembled. It is enormous, dwarfing the emaciated men working on it. The contrast is grotesque. The future, built by the dying. A prisoner collapses. He is dragged away. Another takes his place. Von Braun walks through these tunnels. He inspects the rockets. He gives orders. He knows what is happening here. And he keeps working, because the dream, the moon, the stars, justifies everything. But Germany's wonder weapons were not limited to the V1 and V2. There were other projects, far more advanced, that never fully reached deployment but should have terrified the Allies even more. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was the world's first operational jet fighter. It could fly at 540 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour faster than the best Allied fighters. It had 4 30mm cannons that could shred a bomber in seconds. Allied pilots who encountered it described it as unfair. One American P-51 pilot later says, "You would see this thing streak past you, and by the time you turned your head, it was gone. You couldn't catch it. You couldn't outmaneuver it. All you could do was hope it didn't come back." If Germany had mass-produced the Me-262 earlier, if Hitler had not insisted it be used as a bomber instead of an interceptor, the air war over Europe could have looked very different. Allied bombing might have been far more costly. The invasion of Europe might have been delayed. But by the time the Me-262 was deployed properly, it was too late. Germany did not have the fuel, the pilots, or the infrastructure. Still, the Me-262 shot down over 500 Allied aircraft before the war ended. And after the war, both the United States and the Soviet Union captured Me-262s, studied them, and used the technology to build their own jet fighters. There were also flying wing designs, like the Horten Ho 229, that looked like something from science fiction, a jet-powered aircraft with no fuselage, no tail, just a smooth, seamless wing. It was designed to be fast, long-range, and crucially, have a very low radar signature. An early attempt at stealth. Only a handful were built before the war ended. But decades later, when American engineers tested a captured Ho 229, they found that its radar cross-section was indeed significantly smaller than conventional aircraft. The Horten Ho 229 looks eerily like the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. That is not a coincidence. There were also projects for vertical takeoff aircraft, guided surface-to-air missiles like the Wasserfall, and even concepts for suborbital spaceplanes, like the Silbervogel or Silverbird, that would skip along the upper atmosphere to strike targets in North America. None of these projects fully succeeded. But the fact that German engineers were even thinking about stealth bombers, guided missiles, and space planes in 1944 tells you how far ahead they were. By April 1945, the war is over, in all but name. Soviet forces are closing in on Berlin from the east. American and British forces are sweeping through southern Germany. The Reich is collapsing. Von Braun and his team face a choice: surrender to the Soviets, who will likely execute or imprison them, stay in Germany and face whatever justice the Allies impose, or surrender to the Americans and hope they see value in the knowledge he carries. Von Braun chooses the Americans. He and about 500 of his top engineers make their way south, away from the advancing Soviets, and surrender to US forces in Bavaria. They bring with them truckloads of documents, blueprints, and rocket components, everything the Americans need to continue their work. And the Americans are very, very interested. If you find this kind of hidden history as unsettling and fascinating as we do, we would be honored if you would hit that subscribe button. These stories of genius, terror, and moral compromise shape the world we live in, and by subscribing, you help make sure they are not buried again. Within weeks, a secret operation begins. It is codenamed Operation Paperclip. Under this program, the United States government brings over 1 to 600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to America to work on military and aerospace projects. Their Nazi pasts are quietly sanitized, war crimes are overlooked, party memberships are erased from official records, intelligence officers rewrite biographies to make them acceptable. Wernher von Braun, the man who oversaw the construction of V-2 rockets using slave labor from concentration camps, is given a comfortable life in Huntsville, Alabama, working for the U.S. Army on rocket development. By the 1950s, he is designing missiles for the American military. By the 1960s, he is the face of NASA, celebrated as a visionary, the man who will take America to the moon. Think about that. The same mind that designed a weapon to terrorize London also designed the Saturn V rocket that carried American astronauts to the lunar surface. The V-2 killed thousands. The Saturn V made history, and the man behind both is hailed as a hero. The knowledge that von Braun and his colleagues brought to America did not stay in laboratories. It spread, it evolved, and it became the foundation for technologies that define modern warfare and space exploration. The V-1 buzz bomb? That is the ancestor of every cruise missile in service today. The Tomahawk, the Caliber, Storm Shadow. The concept is identical. A small pilotless aircraft that flies to a target and explodes. The V-2 rocket, that is the ancestor of every ballistic missile and space launch vehicle ever built. The Soviet R-7 that launched Sputnik in 1957 was based on captured German V-2 technology and German engineers working in the USSR. The American Redstone rocket that launched Alan Shepard into space in 1961 was designed by von Braun's team using knowledge they brought from Peenemünde. The Saturn V that went to the moon? Same lineage. The engines, the staging, the guidance systems, all of it traces back in part to what German engineers figured out in the 1940s while prisoners died in tunnels beneath their feet. The Me-262 and other German jet designs influenced every jet fighter that came after. The swept wing designs you see on modern aircraft, the Germans figured that out first, testing configurations in wind tunnels at Peenemünde. The Horten Ho 229 flying wing, look at the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. Look at the new B-21 Raider. The principles of stealth, reducing radar cross-section, smooth surfaces, embedded engines were being explored in Nazi Germany in the 1940s. The early guided missiles like the Wasserfall or the Fritz X guided bomb were the ancestors of modern surface-to-air missiles and precision-guided munitions. Even the concept of the intercontinental ballistic missile, the ICBM, the weapon that defined the Cold War, was first seriously explored by German engineers. They did not build one, but they sketched it. They calculated whether it was possible. And 20 years later, both the United States and the Soviet Union had ICBMs pointed at each other. And the world lived under the shadow of nuclear annihilation delivered by rockets that descended directly from von Braun's work. What most people did not know, what they still do not know, is how much of this technology has its roots in Nazi slave labor and war crimes. When Americans watched the Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969, they cheered for von Braun. They saw a visionary, a genius, the man who made the impossible possible. They did not see Mittelbau Dora. They did not see the tunnels. They did not see the 20,000 prisoners who died so that von Braun could build his rockets. And von Braun, he rarely spoke about it. When pressed, he said he regretted the suffering, but that his dream had always been space, and the weapons were just a means to an end. Is that enough? Is it acceptable to build horrors in the pursuit of a dream if the dream eventually comes true? Wernher von Braun died in 1977 at the age of 65 from cancer. He was celebrated at his funeral as one of the greatest aerospace engineers in history. Presidents sent condolences. NASA honored him. His legacy, they said, was the moon. But there is another legacy, one that is harder to celebrate. Over 20,000 people died in the tunnels building the V2. Most of them were buried in mass graves or cremated. Their names are forgotten. Their families never learned what happened to them. They were erased. And the rockets they built, the ones that killed thousands in London and Antwerp, became the foundation for the missiles and spacecraft we still launch today. So when you see a rocket lifting off, whether it is carrying astronauts to the International Space Station or a satellite into orbit or a warhead across a continent, you are seeing the descendant of the V2, and that raises questions we have never fully answered. Could these weapons have ever truly won the war? Or could they only have stretched out the killing, made the nightmare last longer, cost more lives? Most historians say no. They could not have delivered victory. Germany was facing the combined industrial might of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Even if every wonder weapon had worked perfectly, Germany simply did not have the resources or time to turn the tide. But they could have prolonged the war. They could have made the Allied bombing campaign far more costly. They could have delayed the invasion of Europe. They could have killed tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands more people before the end. So, no, the wonder weapons probably could not have won the war, but they could have made the horror last longer. Now, I want to ask you some hard questions, and I want you to think about them honestly. Should the scientists behind weapons like the V2, the men who used slave labor, who built terror weapons, should they have been put on trial at Nuremberg? Or was it acceptable to hire them, as both the United States and the Soviet Union did, because the knowledge they had was too valuable to lose? If you had been sitting in a Pentagon office in 1945 and someone handed you a file on Wernher von Braun, would you have said, arrest him or hire him? And here's the hardest question. When you look at modern missiles, stealth bombers and rockets, technologies that protect us, that explore space, that define modern military power, do you see pure progress, or do you see the lingering shadow of a nightmare that began in the labs and tunnels of the Third Reich? Can technology be separated from the regime that created it? When we admire the engineering of a Saturn V rocket, are we obliged to remember that the man who designed it also designed the V2, a weapon that killed thousands of civilians? When we celebrate the moon landing, do we also have to acknowledge that it was built in part on knowledge gained through slave labor and war crimes? I do not have an easy answer. But I think we have to ask the question. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Every click tells the algorithm that this piece of history is worth remembering. We are dedicated to rescuing these difficult, forgotten stories from the archives. If you want to join us on this mission, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment with your city or state and tell us, were these scientists geniuses, monsters, or something far more complicated? Because this story is not over. The technologies born in Hitler's labs are still evolving. The missiles we launch, the spacecraft we build, the weapons we deploy, they all carry echoes of decisions made in 1945. And whether that is progress or a moral failure might depend on where you are standing and what you are willing to accept. Thank you for making sure the people who died in those tunnels, and the people who still live under the shadows of their rockets do not disappear into silence. They deserve to be remembered.